20 months after I buried my husband, I walked into my attorney's office and saw myself sitting in the waiting room. Not exactly myself. Not a mirror. But close enough that the receptionist looked between us twice with the particular discomfort of someone who has noticed something they cannot immediately explain. The woman was approximately my age. Silver brown hair, shoulder length, slightly wavy. Hazel eyes. The same careful posture of a woman who has learned to hold herself upright through things that would bend most people. She was wearing a dark navy blouse and pearl earrings. She looked up when I walked in. We looked at each other for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then she said, very quietly, "You must be Eleanor." I had never seen her before in my life. She already knew my name. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am 62 years old and I live in Connecticut. Thomas was my husband for 38 years. In the 20 months since his death, I have learned more about the life I believed I was living than I ever expected to know. I did not expect to learn this. If this story stays with you, please subscribe and leave me a comment below. Tell me what city you are watching from tonight. I read every single one. Now let me tell you about the woman in the waiting room. Patricia had asked me to come in on a Thursday morning. The reason was routine, or as routine as anything in my life had become over the past 20 months. A final review of the civil recovery documentation before the last stage of the asset return was processed. Signatures required. Papers to review. The ordinary machinery of a legal process that had been grinding forward for the better part of 2 years and was now, finally, approaching something that resembled completion. I had driven to Patricia's office dozens of times. The route was familiar in the particular way that routes become familiar when you have traveled them repeatedly during periods of significant difficulty. Not comfortable exactly, but known. The parking structure on the left. The coffee shop on the ground floor of the building that I had stopped at twice in the early months, when I needed something warm to hold before going upstairs. The elevator with the slow doors that required patience. I knew all of it. What I did not know was who would be sitting in the waiting room when I arrived. Thomas had been, in the ways that mattered most to daily life, a consistent man. He had consistent habits, consistent preferences, consistent rhythms that I had navigated around for 38 years without registering them as remarkable, because they had simply always been there. The same side of the bed. The same morning routine. The same 3 restaurants he returned to when we went out, because he had found what he liked at each of them, and saw no reason to look further. He had been consistent about other things too. Things I had not known to look for while he was alive and that had become, in the accumulating discoveries of the past 20 months, retrospectively visible in a way that changed how I understood the whole. His type was the word Catherine had used, in one of our early conversations, when she and I were still learning the shape of what we had in common. She had said it matter-of-factly, the way you state something that has become clear through examination rather than through feeling. He had a type. At the time I had understood this to mean women of a certain age, a certain situation, widowed or alone, in a period of grief or transition, vulnerable to the specific attention of a man who listened carefully and remembered everything. That was true. All 4 of the women had fit that description to varying degrees. What I had not yet understood, sitting in Patricia's office in the months after that first conversation with Catherine, was the other dimension of his consistency. The one that became visible the morning I walked into the waiting room and saw a woman with silver brown hair and hazel eyes sitting in the chair across from the receptionist's desk. My own appearance is something I have never thought about with great frequency or intensity. I know what I look like. I have a mirror and I have photographs and I have 20 years of my son telling me I looked tired when I was tired and fine when I was fine. I know that my hair went silver brown in my late 40s and that I kept the wave in it because straightening it required more effort than I was willing to invest on a daily basis. I know that my eyes are hazel green and that they have the kind of lines around them now that come from 6 decades of expression rather than from neglect. I know that I stand straight because my mother stood straight and because 30 years in a classroom teaches you that posture communicates authority before you have opened your mouth. I know what I look like. I had simply never considered that someone else might have found it replicable, reproducible, a template worth returning to. The woman in the waiting room was not my twin. She was not my double. Side by side, we were clearly two different people. Her face was shaped differently at the jaw. Her eyes were darker in the irises. She was perhaps an inch shorter than me. But the overall impression, from a distance of 10 feet in a waiting room with fluorescent lighting, was a resemblance that stopped you. It had stopped the receptionist. It had stopped me. And it had clearly not stopped her, because she had looked up and known immediately who I was. Her name was Miriam Cole. I did not know that yet when I sat down across from her in the waiting room. I did not know anything about her yet except that she was there, and that she had known my name, and that the knowing of my name had not surprised her, which meant she had been expecting me or expecting someone who looked like me, which were two different things that I did not yet have enough information to distinguish between. We sat across from each other for approximately 90 seconds before either of us spoke again. She broke the silence. "Patricia told me you might come in this morning," she said. "She didn't tell me, she didn't mention," she stopped. Started again. I wasn't prepared for the resemblance. "Neither was I said. She looked at her hands in her lap. Then back at me. "He called me Eleanor," she said. "Not my name. When we were alone. He said it was a habit he couldn't break." A pause. I thought he meant his late wife. The fluorescent light above us hummed faintly. The receptionist was looking at her screen with the focused attention of someone who has decided that whatever is happening in the waiting room does not require their involvement. "His late wife," I said. "Yes," Miriam said. "He told me she had died 3 years before we met. That he was still, that he had never quite." She stopped again. "He said her name was Eleanor, and that she had been the love of his life, and that he didn't think he would ever fully stop grieving her." I looked at the woman across from me. At the silver brown hair, and the hazel eyes, and the straight careful posture of a woman who had been told she was sitting across from a ghost. "I'm not dead," I said. "I know that now," she said quietly. "I've known for about 6 weeks. Since Patricia's office contacted me." The waiting room door opened and Patricia's assistant appeared. She looked at the two of us. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Brooks? Mrs. Cole? Patricia is ready for you both." Patricia's conference room had hosted many difficult conversations. I knew this from the 18 months I had spent in it, from the particular quality of the room that accumulates in spaces where important and painful things are regularly said, not visible exactly, not something you could point to in the furniture or the lighting, but present. A seriousness that the room carried the way certain rooms carry the history of what has happened in them. Miriam Cole sat to my left at the conference table. Patricia sat across from us both. I had the particular experience, common to me now after 20 months of discoveries, of needing to organize my understanding of a situation very quickly before I had all the relevant information. What I knew was this. Thomas had told Miriam her name was Eleanor, that Eleanor was dead, and that he was a widower who had never recovered from the loss. What I did not yet know was how long this had been happening, what form the relationship had taken, and what had brought Miriam Cole to Patricia's office 6 weeks before she appeared in the waiting room. Patricia, who had spent 18 months learning how to open these conversations, simply said, "Miriam, would you like to start from the beginning?" Miriam looked at her hands on the table. Then she began. She had met Thomas 4 years ago. Not at a grief support group. Not at a church event. Not at any of the locations where he had found the other women. She had met him at an art exhibition at a gallery in New Haven, a small show, a local artist, the kind of event that draws 50 people on a good night and runs for 3 weeks and closes without notice in the broader world. She had been there because a friend had invited her. Thomas had been there, as best she could reconstruct, because the gallery was 40 minutes from Birchwood Lane, and because a man who needed to be somewhere other than home on a Wednesday evening without creating questions had limited options for explaining his absence. They had stood in front of the same painting for several minutes before either of them acknowledged the other's presence. The painting was a landscape, Connecticut hills in late autumn, bare trees, a particular quality of gray-gold light that Miriam said reminded her of the view from her house. Thomas had said it reminded him of somewhere he used to go with his wife. She had said she was sorry for his loss. He had said it had been 3 years and that he was learning to move forward, as people said, though he found the phrase inadequate for the actual experience of trying to build a life after losing someone you had loved for decades. She had found this exactly as affecting as Thomas had intended her to find it. Miriam was 60 years old. Divorced, not widowed, which was a variation from Thomas's usual selection criteria. Though Patricia noted when Miriam mentioned it that divorce and grief share enough structural similarities that the distinction may have mattered less to Thomas than the circumstances that followed it. Her marriage of 22 years had ended 5 years before she met Thomas. Not dramatically. Not with the specific betrayal or discovery that ends some marriages loudly. It had ended in the slow, quiet way of 2 people who had grown into different shapes and had one day looked at each other and understood that the shapes no longer fit together. Her ex-husband was a decent man who lived in the same city, and with whom she maintained a careful, cordial relationship for the sake of their adult daughter. She had spent 5 years rebuilding. A career in arts administration that had resumed after years of reduced hours during the marriage. A house she had made entirely her own. A circle of friends that was smaller than it had been during the married years, but more genuinely chosen. A life that was working. Thomas had appeared in it at a gallery on a Wednesday evening and had spent 3 months being exactly what a man who had spent 38 years studying how to be exactly what a particular woman needed to hear would be. He called her Miriam. Except when they were alone. The Eleanor thing had begun, she said, approximately 2 months into the relationship. Not abruptly. Not in a way that alarmed her at first. He had been talking about his wife, about Eleanor, the dead wife, the woman he had loved for 38 years and lost, and was learning to grieve with the particular wistfulness of a man who keeps returning to a wound because it has not yet fully closed. Miriam had listened with the patience and empathy of a woman who understood long grief. She had lost her father the year before her divorce and knew that grief did not resolve on a schedule. One evening Thomas had looked at her across a restaurant table and said, simply and quietly, that she reminded him of Eleanor. That there was something in the way she held herself, in the quality of her attention, in the particular stillness she had when she was thinking about something. Miriam had taken this as a compliment. She had not yet understood that it was a template. The first time he called her Eleanor by name it had been a slip. Or had appeared to be. They were in her kitchen on a Sunday morning and he had handed her a cup of coffee and said, "Here you are, Eleanor," and then caught himself and apologized immediately. his face carrying exactly the right proportion of embarrassment and residual grief to make the moment feel tender rather than strange. She had told him it was all right. She had meant it. The second time she had noticed it, she did not say anything, because she had begun by then to understand, or to construct an understanding of, what it meant to be with a man who was still partly living alongside the memory of a woman he had loved deeply. She had told herself it was a form of healing. That she was not replacing Eleanor, but perhaps helping Thomas find his way back to the capacity for connection that grief had interrupted. She had told herself this for 4 years. When did you start to question it? Patricia said. Miriam was quiet for a moment. About 8 months ago, she said. He gave me something. A piece of jewelry, a necklace, simple, a gold chain with a small pendant. He said it had belonged to Eleanor. That he wanted me to have it, because he thought Eleanor would have wanted someone to wear it rather than have it sit in a box. She paused. I wore it for 3 weeks. And then a friend of mine, a woman who had known me for 20 years, saw it and asked where I had gotten it. I told her it had belonged to my partner's late wife. She looked at it for a moment, and then she said, very carefully, that it was a style that had been popular perhaps 15 years ago, but that the chain looked newer. That the pendant had the kind of surface where you'd see on something worn regularly rather than stored. She looked at her hands. I took it to a jeweler, she said. He told me the chain had been manufactured within the past 5 years. The conference room was quiet. Thomas gave you a piece of jewelry, he said had belonged to his dead wife, I said, and it was new. Yes, Miriam said. Did you confront him? I tried to, she said. I brought it up carefully. I said I had learned the necklace was newer than he had suggested, and asked if he could explain it. He was very good. He said he had had the original chain replaced because it had broken, that the pendant was original even if the chain wasn't. He was so calm. So reasonable. He had an answer for everything, and the answer was always delivered in a way that made me feel that questioning him was a form of unkindness toward a grieving man. I recognized that. The particular calm. The answer that was waiting before you finished the question. The way doubt was reframed as cruelty before you had time to examine whether it was warranted. What else did you question? Patricia said. Miriam was quiet for a moment. He was never available on certain days, she said. Consistent days. Tuesdays he was always somewhere else. Some Saturdays. He explained it as family obligations. He had a son, he said, and a complicated relationship with his son's family that required regular management. I accepted this. I had my own daughter, and I understood that adult children and their families created obligations that didn't always accommodate other priorities. Tuesdays. I thought about my Tuesdays. About my book club, which met on Tuesday evenings. About the Tuesdays I had been out of the house for 3 or 4 hours, with a regularity that Thomas would have been able to rely on. Did he ever bring you to his home? Patricia said. No, Miriam said. He always came to mine. He said his house was, he said he hadn't been able to change it since Eleanor died. That it was still the way she had left it, and that bringing someone else there felt too soon. For years, I said. He said that for 4 years. Yes, Miriam said quietly. I understood it as grief. I understand now that it was management. She had found out the truth 6 weeks ago. Not through anything Thomas had left behind. Not through a document or a storage unit or a phone or a box from the back of a closet. She had found out because of a woman named Diane, not Diane Prescott, the landscape architect from Western Massachusetts, a different Diane, a woman who had been at the gallery the night Thomas and Miriam met, and who had, for her own reasons, kept track of them. This Diane had known Thomas. Not well. Through a professional connection that had put them in the same room 3 or 4 times over several years. She had recognized him at the gallery. She had watched him introduce himself to Miriam with the practiced ease of a man who was very good at introductions. She had thought about saying something and had not said anything because she did not have enough information to say it with confidence. When Thomas died, she had read the obituary. The real one. The one in the Hartford newspaper that listed his wife of 38 years as Eleanor Brooks, survivor, and that listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest. She had sent Miriam a link. Miriam had read about Eleanor Brooks, wife of 38 years, and had sat in her kitchen for a long time and then had called Patricia Hale's office, whose name she found in a news article about the financial fraud case. Patricia had listened to everything. And then Patricia had asked if Miriam would be willing to come in. "There is something else," Miriam said. She had been speaking for 40 minutes. Her voice had maintained throughout the particular steadiness of a woman who has had 6 weeks to process the initial shock, and has arrived at the stage where the facts can be stated without the stating of them causing immediate collapse. She reached into her bag. She placed a small box on the conference table. "He gave me this," she said. 2 months before he died. He said it was Eleanor's. Her engagement ring. He said he had decided it was time to let it go. She looked at me. He said he wanted me to have it. I looked at the box. I knew before I opened it what I was going to see. I opened it anyway. The ring inside was not my engagement ring. My engagement ring was on my right hand, where I had moved it the week after the funeral. But it was similar, deliberately similar, the same general style, the same proportion of stone to band, the kind of ring that a man who had studied what Eleanor Brooks's engagement ring looked like might choose if he needed a convincing reproduction. He had given her a copy of my ring, and told her it was mine. I closed the box. I set it down on the table. I looked at Patricia. She was already writing. The full picture that emerged over the following 3 weeks was this. Thomas had maintained his relationship with Miriam Cole for 4 years. He had constructed for her a version of Eleanor Brooks, dead, beloved, irreplaceable, that served a specific function. Not just as cover for his unavailability. As a model. A template that Miriam was supposed to be filling, consciously or not, in the architecture of what Thomas was building. He had chosen her because she resembled me. He had named her after me when they were alone. He had given her jewelry he described as mine. He had, Sandra found when she examined Thomas's personal email account, the real one, not the Daniel Mercer account, sent Miriam photographs of Connecticut landscapes, of rooms, of small ordinary things, accompanied by notes that described them as places Eleanor and I went, things Eleanor loved, memories I wanted to share with you. He had been constructing, for 4 years, a woman who was me. Or rather, a woman who believed she was becoming the woman he had told her he had lost. I sat in Patricia's conference room and thought about what that required of Thomas. The sustained attention. The specific detail work. The patience of a man who was simultaneously managing 4 other women, a false passport, a financial fraud, a poisoning, and a marriage, while also curating for a 5th woman a version of his dead wife that was detailed enough and consistent enough to be convincing for 4 years. Why? Miriam said at one point. She was asking the room rather than me specifically. Why go to all of that trouble? Why not simply, she stopped. Why construct Eleanor? Why not just be with someone new? I thought about it. Because Eleanor was the story he told himself, I said. About who he was. About what he had been. About the love that had defined him. A pause. He needed someone to be Eleanor, because without Eleanor the story didn't hold. Miriam was quiet. "That is the saddest thing I have ever heard," she said finally. "Yes," I said. "It is." 3 weeks after our first meeting in the waiting room, Miriam called me directly. Not through Patricia. Not through any of the formal channels that had structured most of the significant communications of the past 20 months. She called my personal number, which I had given her at the end of our second meeting in Patricia's office, when we had both understood, without discussing it explicitly, that what was developing between us did not fit neatly into any of the existing categories. She called on a Sunday evening. I was in the garden. October light, the last of it, coming through the trees at the angle that means the afternoon is finished and the evening is beginning. I had been dividing a clump of ornamental grass, with the focused physical satisfaction of work that asks nothing of your mind except your hands. I answered. "There is something I didn't tell Patricia," Miriam said. "I need to tell you first. Before anyone else." I set down the garden fork. "Tell me," I said. A pause. "He kept a journal," she said. "Thomas. He left it at my house approximately 3 months before he died. He said he was simplifying, going through old things, deciding what to keep and what to let go. He gave me a box of what he described as personal items he didn't want to bring back to the house. Books, a few small objects, the journal." I was very still. "He said the journal was private," she said. "He asked me not to read it. He said it was something he had kept for years, and that it contained things he wasn't ready to share, but didn't want to destroy. He asked me to simply hold it." "You kept it," I said. "I kept it for 8 months," she said. "I didn't read it. I respected what he asked." A pause. "Then I found out who he actually was. And I took the journal out of the box. And I read it." The garden was very quiet around me. A bird somewhere. The sound of a neighbor's car on the street. "What's in it?" I said. Miriam was quiet for a long moment. "Everything," she said. "He documented everything. Not the finances, this isn't accounts and transfers. This is the other record. The one he kept for himself." Another pause. "Eleanor. He wrote about you constantly. Through the whole journal, across years of entries about Catherine and Ruth and Diane and Margaret and me, every significant entry comes back to you. To what he was doing and why and what he understood about what it was costing." I sat down on the garden wall. "He knew what it was costing," I said. "Yes. He knew exactly. He wrote about it with a precision that is." She stopped. "It is the most painful thing I have ever read. A man who understood completely what he was destroying and could not stop, and documented his understanding of that in a journal he kept for 30 years. I looked at the garden in front of me. At the October beds. At the ornamental grass I had been dividing. "Miriam," I said. "I need you to bring me the journal." She came the following Tuesday. I had chosen Tuesday deliberately. My book club day. The day Thomas had known I would be out of the house for 3 to 4 hours, reliably, across the years of his relationship with Miriam. I had chosen it not with irony but with the particular intention of a woman who wanted to reclaim the days that had been used against her. She arrived at 2 in the afternoon with the journal in a canvas bag and the careful posture of a woman carrying something she understands to be significant. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table. She placed the journal between us. It was unremarkable in appearance. A standard hardcover notebook, the kind sold in office supply stores, dark green cover, the elastic band worn from years of being opened and closed. His name was not on it. Nothing on the outside indicated what was inside. I looked at it for a long moment without touching it. You don't have to read it today, Miriam said. I know, I said. I picked it up. The first entry was dated 31 years ago. Not the beginning of the fraud. Not the beginning of the other relationships. The beginning, as far as I could determine from the opening pages, of Thomas's understanding that the life he was building had a flaw at its foundation that he could not fix and could not stop building on. He wrote about me. About the specific quality of my trust, which he described as the most complete thing he had ever been given and the thing he was most afraid of. About the way I signed documents he put in front of me without reading them, because I trusted him. About how that trust was both the foundation of everything good in his life and the thing that made everything else possible. He wrote, "She trusts me the way a person trusts the ground under their feet. She has never considered that the ground might be built on something. I have spent 30 years being grateful for that trust and being aware that I am using it. I do not know how to stop using it. I do not know if the part of me that would stop it exists anymore." I read that 3 times. Miriam watched me read. I turned pages. The journal moved through years in irregular intervals, months of silence, then dense entries, then silence again. The entries clustered around significant moments. The beginning of the relationship with Catherine. The preparation of the false passport. The first time he met Miriam at the gallery. He had written about finding Miriam with a specificity that was, now that I was reading it in my kitchen with the woman sitting across the table from me, both illuminating and deeply strange. She has Eleanor's stillness. The same quality of attention. The same way of holding herself when she is thinking, upright but not rigid. Like a woman who has decided that posture is a form of self-respect. I did not go to the gallery looking for this. I went to the gallery to be somewhere that was not home. I found something I was not looking for, and I understand, already, that I am going to make the same mistake I have made before. He had known immediately. He had recognized Miriam as a version of me from the first evening. And he had proceeded anyway because, as he wrote in the same entry, "The mistake is the only thing I know how to do that feels like the real thing." I set the journal down. I looked at Miriam across the table. She had clearly read this entry. She was watching me with the expression of a woman who knows what you are about to feel because she has already felt it. He knew, I said. He always knew, she said. That's the thing the journal makes clear. He was never operating without awareness. He understood every choice he made, and he made it anyway. I thought about what that meant for the 38 years. For the evenings when he came home at 6:30 and asked about my day. For the way he had cracked the bedroom window in January because he knew I needed it. Both true. Simultaneously. The love and the harm occupying the same years, the same man, the same marriage. There is an entry from 6 months before he died, Miriam said quietly. I think you should read it. I turned to the page she indicated. The entry was short. 3 paragraphs. The handwriting was slightly less precise than in earlier entries. A man in declining health writing with hands that were beginning to betray him. He wrote about the plan. Not the details, those were in the storage unit, in the financial records, in the documentation the investigators had spent a year reconstructing. He wrote about the feeling of the plan. About the relief of having constructed an exit, and the concurrent understanding that the exit was a form of cowardice he had been trying to dress as practicality. The second paragraph was about me. Eleanor will find everything. I have made sure of it. Not deliberately, I am not capable of deliberate honesty after this long. But I have left enough that a woman of her intelligence and her stubbornness will find it all eventually. I think I have always known this. I think the leaving of trails may be the only honest thing I have done. I sat very still. He had known I would find it. Not because he had arranged it deliberately, but because he had not arranged against it. Because some part of him had been leaving doors slightly open for 30 years, leaving keys on rings that didn't match known locks, leaving phones in coat pockets with charged batteries, leaving journals in the hands of women who would one day have reason to read them. The third paragraph was 4 sentences. I have loved Eleanor completely, and I have harmed her completely, and I do not know how to hold both of those things in the same understanding of myself. I have tried for 30 years. The journal is the only place I have ever tried honestly. If she reads this, I want her to know that the love was real. I do not expect that to change anything. I know it doesn't change anything. But it was real. I closed the journal. The kitchen was very quiet. Miriam did not speak. She understood, I think, that there was nothing to say that would be adequate, and that the adequate response to inadequacy is simply to be present without requiring anything. We sat together in my kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon while the October light moved across the table between us. After a long time I picked up my tea. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway. I called Patricia that evening. I told her about the journal. I told her about the entry from 6 months before Thomas's death. I told her what he had written about leaving trails. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Do you want to bring it in?" I thought about it. "Not yet," I said. "I need a few more days with it." "All right," she said. "Take what you need." I set the phone down. I picked up the journal. I read it from the beginning again. All the way through, every entry across 30 years. I read it the way I had learned to read difficult things slowly, in the facts, without rushing toward the feelings until the facts were fully assembled. It took most of the night. When I finished, the sky outside the kitchen window was beginning to lighten in the particular way of early morning, the dark going not to bright, but to a preliminary gray that suggests the day is considering its options. I sat at the table with the journal closed in front of me. I thought about a man who had loved me completely and harmed me completely and documented both with the same precision, and had left the documentation in the hands of a woman who looked like me and trusted her not to read it. He had trusted her not to read it. She had read it. And had brought it directly to me. The irony of that was not lost on me. Thomas's final secret, kept by a woman chosen for her resemblance to his wife, had been delivered by that woman to his wife. I almost smiled. Not quite. But almost. I brought the journal to Patricia on a Thursday morning. Not because Patricia had asked for it again. She had not. She had said, "Take what you need," and had meant it with the particular patience of a lawyer who has learned, over 20 months of working with me, that I process things on a timeline that cannot be usefully rushed. I brought it because I had finished with it in the way you finish with something when you have read it enough times that it has fully joined your understanding and no longer exists separately from it. The journal was not evidence of a crime. Thomas was dead. Whatever it documented about his intentions and his awareness could not be used in any active prosecution. Patricia confirmed this when I placed it on the conference table, which I had known she would confirm, but had needed to hear stated plainly. What it was, Patricia said, was potentially significant in the civil proceedings that were still ongoing. Certain entries describing Thomas's awareness of the financial arrangements and his deliberate structuring of documents in ways designed to be difficult to detect could be relevant to establishing intent in the final stages of the asset recovery. She asked if she could have it reviewed by the investigative team. I said yes. I also said that there were entries I wanted removed from the review copy before it was shared more broadly. The ones about me specifically. The ones about the love that was real. Those were not evidence of anything actionable. They were private in the way that some things remain private even after privacy has been comprehensively violated. Patricia looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded. She made a copy. She handed me back the original. I put it in my bag. I still have it. The journal produced two things of legal significance. The first was an account number, referenced in an entry from 4 years ago, embedded in a paragraph about financial restructuring that Thomas had written in the oblique careful shorthand of a man who documented things for himself rather than for an audience, but legibly enough that Sandra identified it within 48 hours. The account was in a jurisdiction Patricia's team had not previously examined. A small institution, a private bank, the kind that serves clients who value discretion over convenience. The account held assets that had not been located in the original investigations. Not the largest amount we had recovered, but significant. And because it was in Thomas's name directly rather than in the Daniel Mercer name or any of the other constructions, the recovery process was more straightforward than most. Patricia told me the amount on a Wednesday afternoon. I wrote it down. I set the pen down. He documented his own hidden account in his private journal, I said. Yes, Patricia said. The journal he left with a woman he trusted not to read it. Yes. I thought about Thomas writing that entry. About the particular psychology of a man who kept a private record of everything, who could not stop documenting even the things that were meant to be secret, who trusted that the journal would remain unread because he had asked someone not to read it. He had trusted Miriam with the journal the same way he had trusted me for 38 years. Completely. Without accounting for the possibility that the trusted person might one day have reason to look. He was his own undoing, I said. In several respects, Patricia said carefully. Yes. The second thing the journal produced was less concrete and more significant. An entry from 8 years ago described a conversation Thomas had with Gerald Whitmore, his financial advisor, already by that point complicit in the asset movement, about what Thomas called the endpoint question. He wrote, Gerald asked what the endpoint was. I told him I hadn't decided. He said every plan needs an endpoint or it becomes its own problem. I said I knew that. I said I was working on it. What I didn't tell Gerald is that I know what the endpoint is. I have known for a long time. The endpoint is the moment Eleanor understands everything. Not because I want her to, I have spent years ensuring she won't. But because everything I have built has been built in relation to her. Even the exits. Even the escapes. They are all oriented toward what she would think if she knew. What she would do. What she would find. Patricia read the entry twice. She set it down on the table. He built everything in relation to you, she said. Not as a question. Yes, I said. The journals. The trails he left. The account in your name. Yes. Even the plan to disappear was oriented toward you. Toward what you would find when he was gone. I think so, I said. I think he needed me to know eventually. Not while he was alive, that would have required a kind of honesty he wasn't capable of. But afterward. He needed the record to exist. He needed someone to find it. Patricia looked at me for a long moment. That is a very complicated form of love, she said. Yes, I said. It is. Miriam came for dinner 3 weeks after she delivered the journal. This was her suggestion. Offered at the end of a phone call about something practical, a question about the civil proceedings and whether she had any standing in them given that she had been in a relationship with Thomas for 4 years, and offered in the tentative way of someone who is not certain the invitation will be welcome, but has decided to extend it anyway. I said yes without hesitating. She arrived with wine, and the careful good manners of a woman who has been well raised and is also genuinely uncertain of the social protocols applicable to having dinner with the wife of the man you were unknowingly in a relationship with for 4 years. There are no established protocols for this. We were both aware of that. We proceeded without them. I had made soup. The kind that takes most of the day and requires attention at intervals, the kind of cooking I had come to use as a way of structuring difficult days, giving them a rhythm that the mind can follow when it needs something to hold on to. We sat at the kitchen table where I had read the journal. We talked for 3 hours. Not exclusively about Thomas. We talked about her daughter, who was 28 and lived in Boston, and whom Miriam described with the mixture of pride and bafflement that seems to characterize most parents' relationships with their adult children. We talked about my garden and her apartment, and what she had done with the jewelry Thomas had given her, the necklace with the new chain, the ring that was a reproduction of mine. She had returned the ring to Patricia's office, where it had been catalogued and would ultimately be disposed of as part of the estate settlement. The necklace she had kept because, she said, whatever its origins, she had worn it for 3 weeks, and it had become in that time hers in a way that she did not think Thomas's involvement in its provenance could entirely cancel. I told her I thought that was a reasonable position. She looked slightly surprised that I thought so. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" She considered. "Someone angrier," she said. "Or someone more broken. Given everything." "I've had 20 months to work on not being broken," I said. "And I think anger is accurate, but not useful as a sustained state. It was useful in the beginning. It helped me move. Now I find it costs more than it produces." She was quiet for a moment. "He was right about one thing in the journal," she said. "Which thing?" "The intelligence," she said. "And the stubbornness." A pause. "He wrote about those specifically. He said you were the most stubborn person he had ever known, and that the stubbornness and the intelligence together were why he had never told you the truth. Because you would have found all of it. You would have taken it apart until you understood every piece." "He wasn't wrong," I said. "No," she said. "He wasn't." We sat with that for a moment. Outside the kitchen window the November garden was dark and doing its invisible work. Lucas met Miriam in December. I had not planned this exactly, had not arranged a formal introduction. But Lucas came for a Sunday dinner in early December and Miriam happened to be there, because she had called that morning about something related to the civil proceedings, and I had said she was welcome to join us rather than come separately. And she had accepted with the directness that I had come to identify as one of her most consistent qualities. Lucas arrived and walked into the kitchen and stopped. He looked at Miriam. He looked at me. He looked at Miriam again. "Mom," he said carefully. "Who is this?" "This is Miriam Cole," I said. "She is someone I have become acquainted with through the estate process. I'll explain the rest over dinner." He shook Miriam's hand with the careful courtesy of a man who has learned to reserve judgment until he has more information. Over dinner, I told him the relevant parts. The gallery. The 4 years. The journal. The resemblance. He listened in the way he always listened now, completely, without interrupting, his expression moving through things without settling until he had the full picture. When I finished he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Miriam. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what he did to you." Miriam looked slightly surprised. "Thank you," she said. "I'm sorry for what he did to your mother." "He did it to all of us," Lucas said simply. "That seems to be the pattern." Miriam looked at me. I looked at Lucas. For a moment the 3 of us sat at the kitchen table with the full weight of what Thomas had built and what he had cost. And then Lucas reached for the bread and asked Miriam what she did for work, and the dinner continued in the ordinary way of people who have decided, despite everything, to be present at a table together. I found that remarkable. I still do. Gerald Whitmore was released from minimum security in the spring. His 18 months had become 14 with good behavior, which Patricia said was typical and expected and did not indicate anything about the nature of what he had done. He had served his time. He had paid his restitution in installments. He was 63 years old and had no profession to return to and no reputation in the field that had defined him. I did not think about Gerald Whitmore much. He had been a peripheral figure, significant in the specific damage he had facilitated, but peripheral in the larger story. A man who had made choices that were wrong and had paid for them at a level that was proportional, if not entirely satisfying. I thought more about Diane Ashworth, the paralegal from Springfield who had witnessed Thomas's visit to the notary 11 years ago and had carried that memory for a decade before finding a way to use it. I had written to her twice since the second trial. She had written back each time with the careful precision of her handwriting and the directness of someone who has decided that honesty is the only remaining option. In her most recent letter she said she had retired. That she was spending more time with her grandchildren. That she thought about the case sometimes not with regret exactly, but with something she could only describe as the particular alertness of a woman who has learned to notice when something is wrong and not wait so long to say something about it. I understood that alertness. I had developed my own version of it. It was, I had come to believe, one of the more useful things the past 20 months had given me. It is February now. 2 years since Thomas died on a Tuesday morning that I have replayed enough times that it has lost its power to surprise me and retained only its power to instruct. The particular quality of the light that morning. The specific warmth of a cheek kiss from a man who was, in his mind, already somewhere else. The way the house felt when I came home from book club and understood, before I had seen anything, that something was different. 2 years. I have been counting them not because counting helps, but because marking time is one of the ways I stay oriented in a life that has changed its shape so fundamentally that the old landmarks no longer serve as navigation. The new landmarks are different. The garden. Lucas on Sundays. Sophie every other month and more frequently in the summer. Ruth from Providence who drives down and brings food and asks nothing of me except my honest company. Catherine in Lisbon who sends photographs of morning light on water. Miriam, who has become something I do not have a precise word for, not a friend exactly, not a sister, not a fellow victim, though she is elements of all three. A woman who knew a version of my husband that I never knew and who carries that knowledge with the same careful dignity that I have tried to bring to my own version of it. We have dinner every few weeks. We talk about things that have nothing to do with Thomas. That was her suggestion about 2 months in. She said she thought it was important that we know each other as ourselves rather than only in relation to him. That if we only ever talked about Thomas, then Thomas remained the center of something he did not deserve to be the center of any longer. I agreed with her immediately. It was, I thought, an extremely Eleanor thing to say. I told her so. She almost smiled. The journal is in a drawer in my study. I did not destroy it. I did not give it to Patricia's office beyond the reviewed copy. I kept the original because it is the only record that exists of Thomas knowing what he was and not being able to stop. Of a man who loved me completely while harming me completely and documented both with the same pen in the same notebook across 30 years. I do not read it often. Occasionally. When I need to be reminded of something specific. What it reminds me of when I read it is not grief. Not anger. Not even the complicated gratitude of a woman who has found more than she expected to find in the wreckage. It reminds me that people are not simple. That the person who harms you is not only the harm they do. That the love and the damage can occupy the same person across the same decades, and that holding this, not accepting it, not excusing it, but holding it as the full complicated truth, is harder than the simpler version in which people are either good or bad, and you know which one you are dealing with. Thomas was not simply bad. He was genuinely, thoroughly, irreparably complicated. And I loved him for 38 years before I understood that. The loving was real. The understanding is real. Both things are true simultaneously, and I have stopped requiring them to resolve into something simpler. I am going back to Lisbon in April. Not alone this time. Miriam is coming. Her suggestion. She had never been, and I had told her enough about the light, and the morning, and the coffee on the steep street in Alfama that she wanted to see it. Catherine is going to join us for dinner one evening. The three of us at a table in a city that Thomas had planned to disappear to and never reached. I find that I want to be there with these women specifically. With the woman who was going to come with him and didn't, and the woman he made into a copy of me and couldn't. All three of us at a table in Lisbon, which is a beautiful city that had nothing to do with Thomas's plans and everything to do with its own extraordinary light. We are going to go there and eat good food and drink the wine and watch the morning come over the water. That is enough. That is exactly enough. If you are watching this and you have ever loved someone completely, and then discovered they were not entirely what you believed, I want to say something to you directly. The love was real. I know that is not what you want to hear. You want to hear that it was all false, that the man you loved was entirely constructed, that there is no grief required because there was no genuine thing to grieve. That would be simpler. That would allow you to be only angry rather than angry and grieving simultaneously, which is the harder condition. But the love was real. That is not a comfort. It is simply a fact. The real love and the real harm existed in the same person at the same time, and you did not fail to see what was there. You saw what was there. The rest was hidden. You are not foolish for having trusted. You are not broken for having loved. You are a person who gave a real thing to someone who did not deserve all of it, and who has now, in the aftermath, the difficult and necessary work of deciding what to do with what remains. What remains is considerable. I know because I have been doing the work for 2 years, and what I have found, in the doing of it, is that the woman Thomas built his hidden life around is more than what he saw in her. More than the trust he used. More than the Eleanor he described in 30 years of journal entries as the orienting point of everything he could not stop doing. I am more than what he made of me. So are you. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if you have ever discovered that someone you loved had been keeping a version of you in their mind that was different from who you actually are. Tell me what you did with that discovery. I read every single one. And I promise you, the version of you that exists beyond what anyone else made of you is the one worth building toward. I am building toward it still. That is the whole story.